Hello everyone, but not everyone. Not talking to everyone, talking to 4 people, one of whom is Rob D. The other 3 are, 6 people. The other 4 are unknown. And I'm here to talk about the power of vulnerability. Apparently. Howdy, because that's what I promised. Been telling myself a little bit lately that, well, relax, Jason, because you're not charging for this. So there's really no pressure to do or say anything. The only thing is that because I set these things up in advance, I feel like I have to show up. And that in itself creates a kind of pressure. Hi, Jared. So I guess I'm going to be more interactive today if there's an opportunity to, besides saying hello. Partly because I want to reduce the pressure, self-generated pressure, and partly because I don't really have a sense of previous events of this kind. I think this is the 9th now, the 8th. I've had a sort of block of information or insight that I was able to unpack during the course of an hour and 20 minutes. That's been my loose structure. And this time, I'm not sure that I do. I've got this core idea that has actually, hi Ollie, has been going on through my life. I mean, it's been persistent and consistent in my life that making myself vulnerable is the best way to protect myself. I think the first way I became conscious of it was the way of the Fool and the tarot that innocence protects. Now, innocence isn't quite the same as vulnerability, but there's definitely a correlation or an overlap there that hopefully I'll get to. But anyway, the reason that I chose this subject for today, for this week, was something somebody said after the last meeting. There was the Zoom meet with a bunch of us there, and then I had to leave the Zoom meet, and so a few people stayed on without me, and they recorded it, and I got to listen to their conversation afterwards, which was very, very interesting to me, being the fly on the wall. And something somebody said was that as a public personality, I seemed to be very unlike most other public personalities who had a persona that they put forward and that they hid behind in the world, that they used a persona to protect themselves in the world as public personalities. And I seem to do the opposite of that, was that I put my real self forward in order to protect myself. I thought that was a very interesting insight, or idea anyway, and that led me to think about what that is and why I do that and how I do that, and how that would work if it were the case. And I talked about it with my wife, and one of the first sort of most overt examples came up when I went to Morocco. Essentially, I mean, that seemed to be almost a blueprint, or the first time that I fully consciously or semi-consciously fully enacted this methodology or principle, was that I was in a situation where I felt like I couldn't carry on living, that I was going to self-destruct. And in order to protect myself from that eventuality, I actually made myself vulnerable. I sent myself off to Morocco without money, without connections, without a safety net, to put myself in a very dangerous and difficult situation, to make myself vulnerable, trusting that, well, there were two things. One was very basic, and that was that was trusting that my survival instinct would take over, and it would bring me through that in a way that it wouldn't if I was too safe and too overtly protected, too cushioned. And the other thing was that I wanted life itself to intervene. It was a little bit like the thing that Jesus says is that the devil tempts Jesus into doing, which is, throw yourself down and see if the angels lift you up. And Jesus says, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. Well, there was a little bit of hubris in it, I think, for me there. But on the other hand, it was also genuine, because I genuinely wanted to die. So I threw myself into a figurative abyss of Morocco, trusting that life would take care of me. So I put myself at the mercy of life, but also a bunch of predatory Arabs, Moroccans, because anyone who knows about Morocco, and certainly anyone who's been there, is it's a highly predatory environment, generally, but particularly if you're a foreigner. So I went there with almost nothing. I won't go into detail because it's a story I've told many times, and it's part of my own mythos, so I'm a bit wary about referring to it at all. But one of the things that I found out as time went on, within the first month or two, because it was only one time that I was physically attacked, and I was begging on the streets, and that I knew that was dangerous, because, well, I'm supposed to be the one that gets fleeced. I'm not supposed to be there fleecing their culture, relying on their kindness and favors. I'm supposed to be the provider of wealth as a Nazarene and as a foreigner. So I was inverting that and kind of poaching on their territory. So I knew that could be dangerous in and of itself. But anyway, I only got attacked once. And generally speaking, I was given wide berth. And over time, the Moroccans stopped trying to prey on me, because they saw, well, I was begging. I couldn't possibly have money. They couldn't understand that. It didn't make any sense to them. And also, I was dressed in a poncho and Arab shoes and whatnot, and a very peculiar looking foreigner. And I found out that the poncho I wore was very much like the style that Moroccans dressed in back in the 1400s or something like that. So not only was I passing for a native, well, I wasn't really, it wasn't a jalaba, but I was passing for, an ancient kind of medieval kind of native, unconsciously. And what I found out is that they all thought I was crazy. Because why else would a Westerner come to Morocco with no money, from the land of milk and honey, to beg on the streets of Morocco? It made no sense. And of course, they're right, it didn't. It only made sense within my own, psychological mythical narrative that I was generating for myself. I was using the whole of Morocco as not as a playground, but as a well, whatever, a testing ground to test my mettle and to discover something about my resources. And that was quite irrational. But anyway, the point here is, if I ever get to it, was that in Morocco, in the culture there, the Arab culture, crazy people are considered to be touched by God, and therefore they are off limits. You don't mess with them in that culture. They're protected. And that was why I was told, at least by one or two Arabs, that was why nobody was trying to hurt me, was because they all thought I was crazy. And that was certainly something I didn't know going in, or something that it seems kind of multi-layered there, because I mean, innocence and craziness are very closely related. That's the fool archetype. So I was aware of being the fool, and I was aware of an element of craziness in what I was doing, and I was trusting that that would protect me, but I didn't realize there was actually a cultural context for that. There would be a cultural reason why I would be protected if I appeared to be crazy. I was thinking of it much more in metaphysical terms. Of course, the Arab culture is more embedded in metaphysical beliefs, so it makes sense. Um, so, and I was talking about this with my wife, and she mentioned that she had done something not similar to Morocco, but similar to this idea of putting herself in a situation where she would be vulnerable in order to survive, that she'd reached a certain point in her life where she did not know how to go forward. She didn't know how to live or exist or cope, and she felt that she might self-destruct. And because of that and that desperation, she put herself into group therapy, which is a situation in which one is potentially completely exposed and becomes vulnerable, has to become increasingly vulnerable. And it turned out, this is just maybe a minor detail, but to me it was very significant that we'd done this at almost exactly the same time, same month and the same year. This was 20 years before we met. So that there was something quite uncanny about that in terms of a synchronicity. And yes, it's just a synchronicity, but it does suggest that there was something in our souls or in our deep psychology that was moving us simultaneously at exactly the same period in our lives, 20 years before we met. There's a principle of existence that we were being guided by, which is essentially this, that we needed to make ourselves vulnerable in order to be safe, which is, of course, an inherent contradiction. And hopefully I'll get to the meaning of that contradiction. I don't know if I will or not. Just going to see what Sean has written. It's true, and you've been experienced with a persona in the past as well. It's a good example for many of us. Right, so yes, I've had a persona. I mean, a long time after Morocco. It's not as though Morocco stripped me down as I hoped it would. That's why I say it was part of my. It became part of my self-mythologizing that I did that. But at the same time, it was an attempt. I spoke about this with my brother. He put himself up on the cross, and potentially that was an opportunity for him to dissolve his ego, surrender to God, by making himself completely vulnerable in the archetypal manner of the crucifixion. But then he used it to promote himself, and he created a personal myth, a new persona around the guy who got crucified. Well, I did that around, I was the guy who gave up his inheritance and went off to Morocco to die, but lived to tell the tale. And that was close to the beginning of, without laying out the whole thing, but it was in my early 20s that I first was told I was the one. And then when that period of my life sort of collapsed, the bottom fell out, that was when I went to Morocco. And so part of me was, well, if I'm the one, let's put it to the test. And it felt as though the universe did come to my rescue, and all these things and happened. And anyway, so all of that then eventually concretized into my shamanized, spiritualized superego as the one, as I have later deconstructed. So yeah, you've seen Jake the persona, and you've seen Aeolus Cephas, it's another aspect of the one, really. And now you're seeing this guy Jason, who's discovering ways to be more open and more vulnerable and more honest, and so on. But it's still something of a persona. The persona is still there. So what you're seeing is my attempts to make my persona transparent without it being too frightening, without it, for me or for you, without it being threatening for any of us. Like if I feel threatened, then I will compensate for that and behave in ways that will then be threatening to others, and that closes down the space. But on the other hand, or by the same token, if I make myself too vulnerable too quickly, I will feel threatened. And others can also feel threatened by a show of vulnerability. It has to be the right kind of vulnerability. There has to be enough strength in it that it isn't too uncomfortable for anyone involved. I'll add that you went back deep into this area, published old audio and deconstructed it, even stepping somewhat back into it, etc. Yeah, so, I mean, to some extent, I mean, Dave O'Shana said this to me in my last one-to-one with him. He said, you are a role model now. And then he said, even if you don't want to be. And then he said, well, and it's a bit odd, isn't it? Because you do want to be, but you don't want to be. So I'm divided about this whole thing of being a role model. It's kind of embarrassing. It's certainly embarrassing to acknowledge it, because it seems vain and arrogant. But on the other hand, what other point is there, really? I mean, what other reason is there to testify and share if it's not to embody something to the best of our ability that others can be inspired by and given courage, encouraged to embody themselves, to set a good example? Otherwise, why be public at all? Because we live in a mimetic society. We are mimetic beings. So putting myself forward at all means I'm going to be putting myself forward as an example of something. So at least do that somewhat consciously and use it as an opportunity or an impetus to really put my best side forward, not as a persona. My best side is the side that is most vulnerable, most hidden in many ways. And this is, so how can I see it? How can I discover it? I mean, this is an infant. We can see this in infants and children, that they can only feel that they exist. It's the mirror stage, by interacting with the other and by experiencing themselves in the gaze of the other, and like an adult that mimics the child to communicate to the child that it's being seen, and then the child will test that, it will behave, it'll make certain movements, and then when the adult mirrors that, then the child is delighted because it knows that it exists and that it's interacting with its environment, and so on. So it's being validated, it's being constantly validated. Well, there are parts of me, parts of all of us that have never been validated, and it's too late for us to have that infinite experience of loving parents or caregivers mirroring us and validating it. So how do I create a context in which I can articulate and express aspects of my life force, of my soul, that have never been articulated, so that they can be validated, so they can be seen and thereby validated? That's a very meaningful question. How do we do that? By community. But where's community? Where is it? How do we find it? And all of this is embedded in a very, very real world context, which is that I'm somebody who is very public about systematized, organized ritual child abuse and trauma, psychological trauma, mind control, and these subjects that are inherently threatening in so many different ways. They're emotionally and psychologically threatening, but they're also physically threatening. I mean, we're talking about a reality, an existing super culture of organized, ritualized crime that we're embedded in, therefore, that is surrounding us, and that if we provoke it in the wrong way, or if we provoke it in any way, probably, it could destroy us in a heartbeat. And I'm very much on the front line in the anyone can find out where I live and where I work and who my wife is and everything. I mean, I'm completely vulnerable to any kind of retaliation if I should hit a nerve in the wrong way, if I should behave rashly and irrationally, if I should communicate my libido in new ways and articulate hidden aspects of my soul in a way that is just a little bit off, that isn't fully in line with isn't a fully honest and appropriate response that's got an edge of ego or persona or rebellion to it, then I can cross the line from just taking necessary risks to taking unnecessary risks. And as soon as I start taking unnecessary risks, the first unnecessary risk could be my last. This is not to over dramatize. I don't mean to do that. It's merely to give a concrete example of what I'm talking about, because maybe from there we can work our way to the more softer, deeper psychological and spiritual aspects of this situation that we're all in, which it comes down to back to the subject of last week, which is, if I want to embody my life, the life force, more fully, that means I have to articulate things I haven't expressed or articulated before, to make room for the life force to land, to integrate by becoming conscious. That means and that's going to feel inherently unsafe because it's untested, like it's the id. If I gave my id full and free expression like that, it would be like Hyde taking over Mr. Jekyll. It would be a destructive thing. I know that. We all know that. That's why we don't do it. But if we repress it completely, then it comes out exactly in that way eventually anyway. So that's actually the worst case. I mean, it would be better to take a risk and just say, I'm going to act like a crazy person now. That would be better than the opposite extreme, which would just completely repress it, because then it will just come out eventually like a total crazy person. But neither is good. It's the middle way, is to consciously go places that I'm afraid to go, but that I feel I need to go. It's not just about doing things that I'm afraid of because I'm afraid of them. I did that for 10 or 20 years, starting with Morocco, but at a certain point that became unnecessary. Like I would walk, when I lived in Pamplona, I'll catch up on the comments in a second, I would walk around the castle walls every day right along the edge, and then when I'd get to my last point, I would meditate sitting on the edge. This was a, I don't know, 50-foot drop or something like that, and then I would meditate sitting on the edge, and I would do deep meditation. So I would go into these altered states where I was not even aware of my body, and then I would come back and I was sitting right on the edge of an abyss. And on one occasion I even went into Kundalini somatic effects, and I flipped over backwards, which was incredible in and of itself. I have no idea how exactly that happened. It was a like a failed levitation or something. But had I flipped over forward, well, I wouldn't be here today to tell the tale. And then at the end of the meditation, I would stand up with my toes over the edge of the thing, and I would just look out, and I would say the Lord's Prayer, and I was teetering on the abyss like a big gust of wind, which would be very unlikely, but if it came, I would have blown off the edge. And I would do that on a daily basis, just to constantly reduce the fear and anxiety around that as a living, enactment of a larger thing, which is I was, afraid of being too close to the edge. Anyway, point of that was I don't feel the need to do that kind of stuff anymore, and I haven't for a long time. And that was all part of my spiritualized, shamanized ego. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone particularly. I think being driven to overcome your fear is still being driven by your fear, so it's a bit of a Chinese finger trap. And that relates to the subject, the title of this meet, which is that what's the protection spell that works? Well, it's not the one that tries to protect us. It's not the attempt to protect ourselves, particularly through magic. But in general, besides just the basic needs, taking care of needs of food and shelter, doesn't work, because you can't protect yourself from life. I can't protect myself from organized criminals. What could I possibly do to protect myself from that level of malevolence and efficiency and cunning and ruthlessness? Nothing. So then I have to trust that something else will protect me, and that something else is well, it feels a little bit circular, but if I trust in life, then that trust itself will allow me to be in the world in such a way that life supports me. And that is protection. It's a non-protection protection. You don't need to be protected. There's nothing to protect, essentially. Physical survival is not only not guaranteed, it's guaranteed not to be given us. We do not get to survive physically. So that can't be the thing that we're trying to protect, as I say, beyond the practical. This isn't about, this is about levels. As in, I try to be practical in terms of how I approach the subjects that I approach in such a way that it will be non-threatening to those that might be threatened by it. But that's instinctive and intuitive. I actually don't want to threaten. I don't want to go head to head with Satan. I respect Satan. I respect the principles of darkness as principles of existence. It's making me think of my brother, actually, as I remember when I thought that my brother was going to, and I had a vision that he was going to kill himself. He'd blow his brains out with a pistol that he kept by his bed. I knew that if I approached it in the wrong way, it would just make it worse. Because his nihilism meant that he had a philosophy that advocated suicide. So I couldn't say suicide's a sin, you'll go to hell if you kill yourself. Not that I believed that exactly, but just making a point, by exaggerating. I couldn't appeal to him by any of the usual methods. And in fact, all that left was the most honest, which was I love you and I don't want to lose you. And that had to be nested in. Look, you have to make your choices. I don't know. For you, self-destruction might be your path. It might be. So I can't tell you, don't do this, this is the wrong thing, or anything like that, because I don't know. All I can tell you is I don't want to lose you. I did lose him in the end. Might have kept him around a little bit longer by telling him that. I don't know. But the point is when I'm the way that I interact and relate to the forces of darkness or organized malevolence is with respect. It's not with contempt or judgment per se, because it's too big, it's too vast, it's too complex, it's too strange. And what they say, fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Well, if you fear God, then you will encounter Satan. If you fear the all-powerful deity that rules over your existence, then fear will turn that experience into an experience of, a diabolical force. That's the wrathful side of God. And well, so I have a practical fear for these realities, but I also have a respect for what I don't understand. And I guess what I was saying is that if I'm going to make myself absolutely vulnerable, it has to be in such a way that I am also absolutely non-threatening, as in with no opposition, no resistance. And potentially the two go together, because of course somebody who is absolutely vulnerable is somebody who is not threatening. But somebody who is vulnerable and who is afraid is threatening, if you think of a wounded animal. So it has to be a combination of vulnerability and strength, or vulnerability and courage. The courage to be vulnerable and the vulnerability of courage. I don't know quite how that second one works, but I like things to be symmetrical. So I guess I'll think about it. The persona Aeolus Cephas was a very artistic one. Question: why would you feel Morocco be a place you feel is dangerous? Why would Morocco be a place you feel is dangerous? Well, I guess you've never been there, but I'm talking specifically Tangier now. The rest of Morocco would be dangerous in regard to not speaking the language and being a foreigner and just being a very different culture. And well, I'm sure there are other factors there, but seeing as I didn't really go into deep, uncivilized Morocco, I think you just read Paul Bowles to know, there is something inherently primal and primordial about the Arabic culture that would certainly be threatening to a Western psyche, but is also physically dangerous. It's a violent kind of culture. Even the spirituality it's soaked in magic, for one thing, which isn't necessarily the same as violence, but there is an overlap between the magical rituals and practices and the violence in Morocco. But that's a whole other thing. Specifically in terms of my own experience, when you arrive in Tangier, when I arrive, you are immediately a target. You're a mark. You will be surrounded. Well, it's not surrounded because they back off. Once one of them latches onto you, then the others back off because they have its proprietary rights or whatever. But you're essentially there to be fleeced. And as a foreigner, at least this is how it was in 1991. It may have changed to some degree. And also the Moroccan and the Arabic attitude towards Nazarenes is quite a hostile one. As a Nazarene, we're seen as heretics. We don't have a soul with fair game in the Scientological term. And Moroccans are pretty predatory with each other. I mean, so they will steal, they will cheat, they will lie with each other while saying prayers to Allah. This isn't meant to be critical of Moroccans. It's just the way it is. So I'm not talking about all of them. And actually, I think it's probably more of a westernized. I think the more it's become westernized, the more that particular aspect has come to the fore. So that's a qualifier there. And Tangier was an international zone for many years, so it's a very westernized center. But I think I had an inherent sense that that would be a dangerous place to be, and in more ways than one, and that was why I chose it, besides the fact that I could get high there anytime I wanted. Even if I had no money, I knew I'd be able to get high. And I wasn't wrong. Like I say, I was protected by certain cultural norms that they thought I was crazy, but certainly even with that, I was definitely in a more life-threatening environment than any other time before or since. Does your best side not align with the Tao or the Logos? Prana, Soba, Jeet Kune Do, Hail. Does my best side, yeah, my best side would align with those things that aren't things. But that's, I mean, we're talking about surrender. I'm talking about surrender here, aren't I? When we talk about vulnerability and becoming vulnerable, it's surrendering of the need for control. And a safe space, so-called, as it's become understood now, is a space that we have control over. A safe space is where nobody's going to trigger you. Well, that's a bit like the occult rituals of magic, of protection spells. It doesn't work. You're just imposing your will on your environment. Eventually it backfires. If you create an environment that's so controlled that nobody can actually be themselves, even you can't be yourself in it, then it becomes a prison. So how I wrote about Crowley in Vice of Kings, the dream I had about Crowley, that magic became so central to his existence that everything for him became a spell. He felt like he had to micromanage every aspect of his existence. It's impossible. Like, there's simply no way to unfold and become integrated with the community and with life and with nature if we're constantly trying to use our will to control everything around us. And that would be sourced in unhealthy attachment, early attachments where we didn't get the validation. We didn't feel that we had a healthy sense of control over our environment. As I'm saying with the child, that through mirroring, it's interesting because I think because children, before they see themselves in the mirror or recognize themselves in the mirror, they do this mirroring with adults, starting with the mother's face. That they smile, the mother smiles, and they smile back, and then so they're mirroring the mother, but then they would begin to see that they can get the mother or the father or the sibling to mirror them. So through communion, really, with the other, they're developing a sense of their own body self, their own existence as a separate body self, and then at a certain point they do see themselves in the mirror. And at that point, well, you're not controlling anything if you're moving in front of a mirror. You're just seeing that you can control your own body. So that's autonomy. You're having a sense of yourself, seeing yourself from the outside. So you can see that if those formative experiences aren't healthy and sufficient, whereby you get to have an experience of having control over others and your environment through the mirroring thing in such a way that you feel safe and you no longer need to persist with it, it doesn't become neurotic. Then you can just move into a healthy relationship with your body, and it's enough to simply have control over your own actions. You don't need to have control over anything else, and that's where this vulnerability spell or non-spell comes in. That as long as I have sufficient control over my own actions, i.e., I am acting sufficiently consciously, I'm not going to self-sabotage. I'm not going to provoke hostile reactions. Thereby, I don't need to protect myself. I can just keep living. Then I can also allow myself to become more and more vulnerable, because I have the consciousness and the responsibility to trust that whatever I say or do will not lead to a hostile reaction. So I'm extending the safety of the space around my body, or expanding it further and further into the world, into the community, until eventually the whole of humanity becomes the safe space that I exist in psychically, and beyond that, the whole of existence, that becomes the safe space that I'm in, the universe itself, and beyond the universe. Which sounds, of course, very highfalutin and ambitious, but it isn't really that ambitious. I mean, it's no more ambitious than whatever we're doing in this moment that is expanding that space of safety, that is really a space of trust that we can handle anything that comes up and out of us, and anything that comes into us from outside of us, that we can handle it. That's the only ambition we need, or the only courage we need. It's a moment to moment thing. We don't have to think about, unless we want to, how this is mirrored, how the ultimate example of this was Christ on the cross. That at a certain point we have to be willing to actually be crucified. Not literally. My brother did it. Doesn't work if you literalize these things. And, well, I want to say something that, a little bit of anxiety is okay to cross the threshold, but if we still have experience after we cross the threshold, if we're not able to enjoy the space that we've entered into to expand our spaciousness, then it's probably better to take a step back, because then the chances are I'm being compulsively driven to face my fears and so on. And that's not going to allow the life force. If there's a contraction in the body and then in the psyche, then there's no expansion is happening by definition. And then it's neurotically driven, and then we're going to encounter resistance, and actually end up trusting less rather than more. Just reading the comments about Morocco. I think we're onto a new subject. Jordan Peterson says agreeable people get used and bullied. So is agreeable the same as vulnerable? Well, Jordan Peterson is not a very good role model, in my opinion. He might have some strength, but I don't think he has any vulnerability. Or at least, anyway, I don't want to get fixated on Jordan Peterson, but the specifics of that, I mean, that question is specific to Jordan Peterson, and why I don't think he's a good role model is that he's I think there's an imbalance in what he's been presenting. I think it's very externalized. It's not internalized. There's a masculine. He's embodying a masculine and a fatherly thing, but oh gosh, it's back to this vulnerability and strength. I mean, yeah, that it has to be both. So anyway, being agreeable and being vulnerable, they're definitely not synonymous. I'm not an agreeable person at all. I suppose they both relate to boundaries. Like a person who's too agreeable has no boundaries, and vulnerability does relate to a lowering of boundaries. But I'd see agreeable. Vulnerability has to do with letting oneself be seen. To me, that's the core of it. I need to be seen in order to see myself and to know that I exist. It's very basic. And the more I let of myself be seen, the more vulnerable I'm going to feel. And therefore, the more vulnerable I'm able to allow myself to feel, the more seen I can be. And the ultimate goal here would seem to be not just to not hide anything, but to have nowhere to hide. This is what I've become aware of, is that when we hide aspects of ourselves from others in the world, we are also hiding. We are hiding. We are in hiding. And that is very comfortable and very secure. That's why we do it. But it's also very limiting, and it's a limited option. Like, we can't hide forever. We can't hide anything forever. Eventually, all things will be revealed. Like God sees every sparrow that falls, and He counts every hair on my thinning haired head. And so we're already being seen. Every aspect of us is being seen here and now, from the moment of our conception to the moment of our death, when we perhaps will realize that we were never able to hide anything. So yeah, vulnerability is a survival strategy for the soul, not for the body. So, how does violence in the UK manifest? How does UK spirituality and magic work in comparison to US or Morocco? Gosh, that's a very complex question. I'm just going to have to skip over that for now. I may come back to it. Why qualify by equating dishonesty with Westerners? I've travelled the length and breadth of Europe. Dishonesty is not a trait I've noticed. On the contrary. No, I wasn't. I just didn't want it to seem like I was equating dishonesty, or I didn't want to be equating dishonesty with Arabs, because I said they lie and they cheat and they steal even with each other, never mind with Westerners. And so I think it was more about when two cultures collide and there's a mimesis that's going on between cultures that are antithetical, then weird things happen. That's all. And I can only know what Moroccans are like with me, right? With a Westerner. I can observe them with each other, but I'm still there observing it, and they know it. So anyway, yeah. So will is required to make the choice to perpetually surrender. Just as strength, courage is required to allow yourself to be vulnerable. I think I get it. That is the paradox, isn't it? Will is required to make the choice to perpetually surrender. It is a paradox because ideally, in an optimal state of being, what I discover, I think, pressure on my head there, is that if I will the right things, I will find out that I was really surrendering. I thought I was willing something, but in fact I was surrendering. So let's say I go to yoga once a week. I don't really want to, so it seems like I'm using my will to go to yoga. But the reason I do that is because I always feel better after going to yoga. So it's as if my body knows that yoga is what it wants and needs, and my body is trying to get my mind to surrender to it and take it to yoga. My body's really taking my mind. Of course, my body's doing all the mechanical things. But the dynamic is such that my mind or my will, depending on where you think the will is sourced, can override my body. And I want the will of my body to be stronger than the will of my mind. And I think that the will of the body is a response to physical environment. So it's an alignment of the body. There's just an organic response to the environment. There's no will required, so to speak. It's just a response, almost like a reflex, but not that there has to be a pressure or a knock. Now, well, there'll be some pressure. And so what's surrendering is the mind. The mind is surrendering, even though it seems as though the mind is willing, is using will there. And that's a trial and error thing. So like these meetings, I mean, I set them up in advance because I want people to know about them in advance. But the problem with that is I'm committed. And so come Friday night, as happened last night, I wake up and I'm having insomnia and I'm thinking, oh shit, I've committed to this meeting. I wish I hadn't, or maybe I can get out of it. And of course I can. And I did consider not showing up today during the night, but turned out that I slept enough to feel okay about coming. But there's still like, is it my will getting me here, or am I surrendering to something that my body wants and needs to do? Is my ego involved in this? That's so critical, or the extent to it which it is, and that goes on throughout these presentation thingamajigs. That is a constant concern for me. Like, when am I using my will to speak in a way that's surrendering to the life force so that it can express, and when am I using my will to maintain my persona? How vulnerable am I willing to be? Vulnerability is openness, and that's what allows the life force to move. That's why we need it. We can't connect to the core of our strength without being vulnerable enough for the life force to move us and to dwell in us. So this is what I'm trying to say. Conversely, the people who most aggressively try to weave their own synthetic protection spells are often the most uncomfortable with vulnerability. TY, is there an association between being vulnerable and being humble? Yes, there is. Does the body rule the mind, or does the mind rule the body? Oh, I don't know. Because, well, I feel like I've gone into that subject quite a lot, but I suggest considering that the mind is a function of the body, like digestion. Consider that possibility. The body itself is generating thoughts, and part of what's going on, as I talked about in one of these early meets, is the body's trying to free itself of language, free itself of a program, of a socio-cultural programming. So when we think thoughts over and over again, we're like, actually, it's the body's trying to push them out. And so then the body keeps experiencing those thoughts again and again. So now that's a particular kind of mind. There's a higher, deeper mind, which would be nous or logos, then that's something that the body itself is nested within. As in the beginning was the Word made flesh, the body itself is the Word of God. That model, I think, is compatible with the one I just said, because we have to empty out the body of the sociocultural program, which is the satanic implant, in order for the incarnation to occur, for the body itself to become language, or an expression of the language of existence. So we're being moved by consciousness articulating itself through the body, not just ours, but the collective consciousness, or the whole of consciousness. But see, right now I'm experiencing this pressure around my head, which I interpret as saying, you don't know what you're talking about now. Like mentally, I know what I'm talking about, but I crossed a line there from talking experientially to talking abstractly. And although I can wing it, because mentally I think it's true, I'm not embodying that. And so my body was communicating that. The life force was probably contracting because it wasn't able to dwell in those words. So then the cultural program was taking over. And I'd say that's happening to all of us, moment to moment basis. Like every instant is a moment of choice. Like do we let the life force express, or do we give this moment or this expression to our life force, or do we give it to our minds or our egos, or whatever it is, that we're going to call that, the other thing, the implant? Or does the spirit rule them both? Does the same application of vulnerability apply to large demographics in the same way it does to individuals? That's a difficult question for me. I mean, I think central to this whole thing, and what I keep circling around and trying to step into, articulate, is that there are no individuals. Like the base reality that our minds are keeping us out of is the reality of the communal soul, and the body that is an organ of perception of the communal soul. And thereby the body, just as our bodies are all connected to the earth and interconnected by the earth, as in I am now touching the same earth that you are all touching, and the same air that I'm breathing is connected to the air that you're breathing. Just as physically we're inseparable in that regard, we're at an even deeper level, we're embedded in, or we're extending from a communal soul that I don't think is partitioned off into these separate souls, the monad souls, that is central to occultism, the perfection of the soul, or the energy body, or the light body, and in order to survive death and so on. And of course that is central to protection rituals and whatnot. Like, who are we protecting? If we do a ritual or a prayer, I need protection now. What do we need protection from? And who needs protection? It's not clear. It's not clear cut. So – one of the things that I've got this week, which I think is related, but I don't know how. I'm definitely less clear today about what exactly the subject is, or how to talk about it. Gosh, it's been on an hour. It's crazy. Feels like half an hour at most. Is the observer effect, which Gibb Strange brought up. He's not here today, but he's written a piece about it. And the observer effect has at least two applications. One everybody knows is quantum physics, as in, the observation of the experiment affects the outcome. Schrodinger's cat and all that thing. The particle and the wave, more accurately. If you're looking for a particle, as a physicist, you find the particle. If you're looking for the wave, you find the wave. So it's like matter behaves self-consciously. It's being observed. It's got theory of mind, and it puts forward the face that it knows is expected. Let's say that's quantum mechanics, supposedly. But the other thing that I wasn't familiar with was in psychology, and it's much more simple and experiential, that being observed alters people's behaviors. And I'm most aware of this, or most familiar with this idea in terms of self-consciousness, as in, even to this day, if I'm doing something and somebody starts watching me do it, even something as simple as eating. Yesterday I was in the Korean restaurant eating with chopsticks with my wife, and it's hard for me to use chopsticks. She finished her meal first. Actually, we were talking about the observer effect too, so it's very fractal. And so she was thinking and looking in my direction, so I felt like she was watching me try to use the chopsticks, and I found I couldn't use them. I was using them even less well than I had been before because of that self-consciousness. And so that's the way that probably most of us experience it, most in terms of self-consciousness, that it's harder to be relaxed if somebody's watching what we're doing. And because that's a kind of vulnerability. We feel vulnerable when we're being looked at. And that creates a sort of tension. And but there's a flip side, which is that what I explore with the podcast and these meets and all the rest of it is that if we can create the right context for being observed, and group therapy is this, then our behavior will change as a result of being observed, not because we've become more self-conscious, but because we've become more self-aware. And we've become more courageous. And that's the other kind of vulnerability. There's the vulnerability that disempowers and the vulnerability that empowers. And I think, this is all new ground to me. I think this is probably central to social engineering and how, bringing it back to crowds and individuals. Because, of course, now we live in the panopticon, in which everyone is being observed on the one hand, and at the same time can participate in their own performance, as in they can create their own audience and be observed in a context that they feel is empowering. But just being monitored is generally seen as disempowering, although it doesn't necessarily make people feel self-conscious. I suppose it makes people feel, it is similar, because they feel, well, I'm being tracked, so I better watch out what I say, and so on. I forget where I was going now. Social engineering. And it occurred to me that yesterday, that actors are examples of individuals with a great deal of power and influence in our society who have mastered the observer effect, as in they have used the experience of being observed as a way to empower themselves and as a way to generate a stellar personality. Now, obviously, actors, they're movie stars because they're famous, they're being observed. But what I mean is that they've had to develop a method for acting in front of people, cameras and whatnot, where the awareness of being observed is absolutely central to what they're doing. They cannot be self-conscious. And the most successful and the most charismatic actors are those who are the least self-conscious. And even to the extent you can have someone like Gary Cooper or Clint Eastwood, they couldn't even really act, but what they were able to do was be in front of the camera without being self-conscious. So just as a physical presence, then the charisma shone through. So they were able to not just neutralize the observer effect, but to maximize the potential of it in order to gain power from it. And of course, gurus and spiritual teachers do this also. They generate an audience and then they become something more than they were before via the energy of the audience of being observed. So this brings it full circle to what I'm doing here or not doing. Both, I keep trying to stay on the vulnerable thing, which is using the attention, using the space of being observed to express new aspects of myself and to expose myself in new ways and to learn to be vulnerable in new ways. But the tendency in our culture is either just to be more self-conscious, therefore more fake and inauthentic, which shuts down the life force, or as a compensation for that, to develop a persona that's very effective and can appear authentic, but actually isn't, is using the experience of being observed to empower itself rather than to expose itself. And honestly, I don't know where I'm at with that, because I'm saying that the power of vulnerability itself is empowering, but clearly that's the opposite kind of empowerment that I'm talking about. It's an empowerment that brings people closer together rather than separates them. So it's non-hierarchical. And we exist in a hierarchical society with a cryptocracy that its power is through not being observed. And then the lower levels, the power of the visible controllers, the ruling classes, their power is through being observed, through open overt influence. And then you have the rest of us who are unconsciously angling for that power by trying to imitate what we perceive, what we observe as the self-empowering behaviors. Anyway, as I say, that's new to me, so it's not really very well formulated, probably. I'll just read this one. Entropy, the gradual decline into disorder, that perpetual force we are all fighting against, which presses downward on all of our desires and willpower to, for example, get up and go to yoga. Well, I feel as though that maybe I wasn't ready to talk about this subject. On the other hand, I've talked for an hour and 10 minutes and it seems like much less. So I suppose that's a good sign of something. I guess I like to try and get to core principles of things, and I was hoping to get closer to the core principle of the subject, which is why it's helpful to allow ourselves to be more vulnerable. Of course, I blog posted about it, so there's quite a lot in there. In this regard, why I think a great deal of it has to do with trust. Am I trustworthy? Are you trustworthy? Can we trust one another? And our general social norm is to try to determine how much we can trust someone before we reveal too much about ourselves. And I tend to try and invert that as much as possible into let me reveal more about myself to find out how much I can trust this environment that I'm in. And so far it's working. And what I'm discovering is that we can trust each other, provided we're able to be honest enough about how untrustworthy we are. So it's not about being trustworthy, it's about being honest about our untrustworthiness. And that more specifically or more palpably or viscerally is about, as I wrote in the blog post, not about how deficient we are, but about how aware and honest we are about our deficiency. And that to me relates to how much we're struggling against our own traumatic programming. So, and I wrote in the blog post, I had this experience of being with strangers, and they were all there. We were all there to look at and work on our trauma. And the difference between that and being surrounded by traumatized people in a thrift store who were there to buy stuff and to get validated, not specifically, so unconscious validation, who are acting unconsciously, and how difficult it is to connect and to trust in that environment, which is just an ordinary social environment, as compared to a space that's been created specifically as a bubble within the greater society in which people not only can be vulnerable, but that's why they're there. Like, there's no point in being there unless they're going to be vulnerable, because the premise is that they're wounded. And I said earlier, a wounded animal can be dangerous. Now, that would be to the extent to which the wounded animal is trying to defend itself. If a wounded animal is in good hands and feels that it's being taken care of and its wounds are being tended, then it won't fight back. So how can we help to accentuate that aspect of community in which we are able to express and articulate our woundedness and receive a compassionate response and give compassionate responses to that, not as a big wallowing of self-pity, but as a getting back to the ground of reality, which is this, that if you're walking around with a bleeding stump for a limb, you don't want to be pretending that you're ready to run the Olympics. It's just a bad situation for everyone, because you're dying now, but you're pretending you're not, and everyone has to go along with it and pretend too. So then they resent you for it, and then that they feel it's not safe for them to show their woundedness, and so on and so forth. That's the kind of society that we're in at this point. And this is like why I try to bridge the researches about organized ritual abuse and so on and so forth with my own experience, because if this is real, if this stuff we're discovering and looking into in the nature of society is real, then it means that everybody is walking around with gaping wounds and pretending that they're not. And so that's the thing to address. It isn't these power structures and how can we confront them, expose them, and topple them. It's look at all these wounded people, what can we do to help them and heal them? And so first of all, make them, create a space in which we can feel safe, in which we're safe enough to acknowledge how wounded we are, be vulnerable, be as vulnerable as we are. So being vulnerable is about not pretending to be invulnerable, essentially. So again, it's getting back to reality. I had there's an unfinished thought in there. Well, I think it was back to what I said earlier, that I'm not interested in being a threat to the powers that be. I'm only interested in helping the victims of the power structures and the power abuses to heal, or participating in that healing process. And it stands to reason, like, until we're whole, we can't do anything to reshape society. Okay, well, I guess that's probably it for today. I guess these events are always different. They're different every time, and I knew this one was going to be different because I could feel it coming in. I definitely felt more self-conscious this time, and I'm sure it's shown. And maybe it is to do with the bringing consciousness to this very subject. Like last week, I was going to talk about reclaiming the life force, and I was more, apparently, I was told that I was kind of more loose and unpredictable last time, and this time I'm talking about vulnerability and the relationship it has to being observed and feeling self-conscious, and I do feel more like that today. So hopefully at least it's consistent with the subject matter. Anyway, I have to keep reminding myself that nobody's paying for this, so it's not like I'm anyone can ask for their money back, or it's all about me and how much I can really feel good about myself. And that really is true. That's not meant to be sarcasm or irony. Like, that's the reason for me to do these things, is so I can experience myself in new ways and feel better about who I am and accept myself more. That's the payoff for me, and that's why I will continue to do them as long as I do, however long that is, regardless of whether there's any overt benefits in terms of book sales or donations, because clearly it's in it, it's in my interest to do it, and hopefully that also erases or neutralizes or reduces the danger of hierarchical relations, or me falling into any kind of authority figure trap there, like somebody who's talking about things he knows to people who don't know, that whole dynamic. Yes, I wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't for my own good, and not because I want lots of followers. Although I do want followers on YouTube, and I do want you to buy my books, Seen and Not Seen. Particularly that one, I think it's very overlooked. It's the first in this trilogy, and it might seem that it's only about movies. In many ways, it's the most personal. So I would ask listeners if you enjoyed this, and if you haven't bought any of my books, to buy one or all of them, the three, Seen Not Seen, Prisoner of Infinity, and Vice of Kings, and subscribe to the YouTube channel, donate via the website, listen to the Liminal List, read the blog, and so on, and all of that. I feel as though things are going very well for me in that regard. I am experiencing a sort of steady stream of positive validation that hopefully won't go to my head, but will just help me to open my heart more and more as I proceed, and trust that I'm in good company. So that's nice comments. Thanks for the stream. Video feedback is noticeably laggier. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else had that. Mari says she feels better. Barnes and Noble, yes. The Barnes and Noble will carry Vice of Kings. Yeah, you can obviously get it through Amazon. I do like people to review on Amazon because it's the only reviews I get. But it's better if you buy it by some other channel, because we know that Amazon is not a good thing. Okay, so let me open the Zoom meet as per usual and post the link in here in the chat area, and then I will perhaps see some of you over there. Copy Earl. Here it comes. All right. Thanks everyone again. And I'll either see you in Zoom or I'll see you next week if I show up.